G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. This is part 2 of the history of the American
There is
firearm
a
industry.
mind-bogglingly large private market for firearms, as there is in this country right now. These manufacturers, on average, still are very significantly dependent upon government contracts for a significant part of their business.
The private market for guns in America also began to increase in the latter part of the 20th century. Tom Diaz is the author of Making a Killing, The Business of Guns in America.
Up through the early 1970s, the gun industry was integral to American culture, but it was like a hardware store industry. It provided utilitarian firearms primarily for hunting, also for recreational use and marksmanship, and to some extent for self-defense. That said, however, up until mid-1970s, the United States model with respect to regulation of firearms was sort of normal. Nobody thought gun control was controversial. It varied from region to region, but many states and localities had regulations and gun laws. The industry itself was really pedestrian. It provided sort of standard model rifles, handguns, shotguns, and they were for purposes that we would probably today regard as relatively benign. But by the early 1980s to the mid-1980s, the gun industry was in serious trouble. And here's why. A firearm is essentially an indestructible consumer product as compared to, say, a cell phone or even a refrigerator. If it's properly maintained, I could get a firearm that was manufactured and sold in the 18th century, and assuming that it's been well maintained, it still does exactly the same job. So the gun industry came to realize that its markets were saturated. People had about as many guns as they thought they needed, because if you buy a handgun, let's say you're one of these people who believe you need a gun for home defense. How many do you need? You only need one. And so it's kind of hard to sell that person the second gun. Along in this period, the 60s, early 70s, comes a gentleman by the name of William Ruger, Bill Ruger, who created a company, which today is one of the largest manufacturers of handguns in the United States. And Bill Ruger said in several public interviews, we have a little money-making machine here. We just need to make new things. We need new designs, and we need to convince people that the gun you bought last year, just like the car you bought last year, we've changed the design so much you need this new one. That was Bill Ruger's intellectual contribution. Now, in the mid-1980s, there were two companies, an Italian company and an Austrian company, that revolutionized the handgun market in the United States and essentially saved the gun industry.
The 92 FS carries on the gun-making skills and traditions that began the Beretta 92 pistol project back in 1970. And in 1985, the U.S. Army made the 92 its own after the pistol passed the stringent tests of the U.S. Joint...
The Army comes along with a new contract. The Italian company Beretta enters the competition, and they actually win it with a new semi-automatic pistol, and it's what's known as a high-capacity semi-automatic pistol, meaning that in a single loading, the magazine or box of ammunition you put in, you could put in a lot more rounds of ammunition than you could in the old Colt, which the magazine capacity was 7 rounds. Now you can get magazines with 11, 14, even 19 rounds of ammunition. So it's a significant increase in the firepower of handguns.
30 years of perfection. A simple evolution of time. Introduced to the U.S. markets in the 1980s, the first generation of Glock pistols dramatically changed the perception of the police sidearm.
At the same time, roughly the same time, an Austrian company named Glock, which had never manufactured guns before they made door locks, suddenly discovered, wow, there's a market in the United States for guns, and we're going to make them. I think they also had a European competition. So Glock also designed a high-capacity semi-automatic pistol. Beretta had already got the American military market, so Glock aimed at the American law enforcement market. Up until that time, American police forces didn't want anything to do with automatic pistols, semi-automatic pistols. Glock successfully approached the American law enforcement market and began to sell large quantities of their high-capacity semi-automatic pistols. Later, executives of both of these companies, the Italian Beretta and the Austrian Glock, said in interviews with financial publications, we knew that selling to the military, or in the case of Glock, selling to law enforcement, would not do a lot for our profit margins. However, we understood that there was an enormous market in all the revolver owners in the United States. So our task was to convince them that that old-fashioned 6-round revolver that you've got is useless. What you need is our new high-capacity semi-automatic pistol with the high-capacity magazines, and that took off. By the end of the 1980s, virtually every law enforcement force in America had converted to high-capacity semi-automatic pistols, and civilians now began to buy these in large quantities. So that revived the American gun market.
There is absolutely a connection between the arms that are used by police forces and military on the one hand, and the arms that are coveted by private buyers. So as gun technology changes over the course of the later 20th century, as individual gun manufacturers are competing in this very aggressive marketplace for lucrative contracts, they innovate. And they innovate in ways that are initially seen as giving military and police forces an edge, but then those innovations quickly find their way into the civilian market. So high-capacity magazines is one example. And I live in a very liberal part of the country, but even my local grocery store, if I go to the magazine rack, maybe as much as an eighth of the magazines on that rack, or a tenth of the magazines on that rack, are Gun-Afficionado magazines. And very often what they're advertising and fetishizing are military-style guns, guns that look like they would be used by military personnel. And there is an allure there that is absolutely part of the American gun culture.
He says he's trained 20,000 clients since starting his business, Tactical Response, in 1996.
In 2008, 9, and 10, I had 25% increases. 2011, I had a 50% increase.
Why?
People are just, in general, more afraid than they were 10 years ago.
Afraid of what?
I can't really put my finger on it. Like, we have couples that show up, right? And I'll walk over to them while they're loading mags. I'll say, why are you here? They go, well, we bought these guns and we didn't know how to use them. And we bought some food at the house and we've got some medical supplies because we think things are going to get bad in this country.
Something very important happened just in the last decade or 13, 14 years in this country. Arms sales, private arms sales, just exploded after 2005, or really with the advent of Barack Obama as president. And the gun lobby, led most especially by the National Rifle Association, was phenomenally successful in creating an illusion. Again, it's this illusion that government's the enemy. That, what we have is we have these gun manufacturers who are trying to simply satisfy the needs and the desires of freedom-loving Americans, and the government is threatening to come and somehow get in between them and to stop them. And this fear-based campaign, and that's really what it was, it helped convince millions of Americans in a time of declining crime that they were surrounded by danger, and that the only way that they could be safe, and maybe more importantly psychically, the only way that they can keep their families safe, the only way they can keep their children safe, the only way they can keep their community safe, is to become not simply a gun owner, but a person who is always armed and is always ready and is ever alert for threats.
In 2016, journalist Josh Harkinson was working for the magazine Mother Jones and wrote an article on America's largest gun manufacturers. Fully loaded inside the shadowy world of America's 10 biggest gun makers.
Together, these 10 companies that we investigated produced more than 8 million firearms per year for buyers in the United States, accounting for more than 2/3 of the total market. And this market is worth about $8 billion a year.
I know you're watching, so pay attention. You hate my freedom, my religion, and my country. And I will never, never surrender my rights to your terror. I will say what I think, worship according to my beliefs, and raise my children how I see fit. And I defend it all with the Second Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. I cower to no one, because I am the National Rifle Association of America, and I am freedom's safest place.
The NRA is very forceful in advocating for the right to bear arms, and they define that right very broadly. So it's one thing to own a gun, it's another thing to own, a Barrett 50 caliber sniper rifle that can shoot down a helicopter. And the NRA basically believes that any gun is a gun that anybody in the public should be able to have. It polices not only Washington, but the gun industry itself. So in the past, when some gun makers like Smith & Wesson, for example, have attempted to compromise with political forces, with the administration, at the time it was the Clinton administration, and put in place some reasonable controls on preventing sales to criminals, for example, the NRA has targeted them for boycotts. So I think not only are politicians afraid of the NRA, but gun companies are afraid of them.
And the fact that we can't go to school and feel safe every day when we're supposed to feel safe is a problem. And the fact that our senators are sacrificing us for NRA money is a problem. Congress has one job, and that's to make laws. So make some law. I really hope
what will change the United States is the United States' changing demographic. The strongest support for unbridled firearms ownership and sale is a certain demographic, and they're mostly older white men. If you look at what's happening in the United States, however, we have a growing youth demographic. We have a large immigrant community, and we have a growing diversity in ethnicity. All of these three communities and the so-called parkland kids do not buy into the traditional American gun culture. So the optimistic side of me says this is going to be, it's not going to be a weeks-long story, but they're going to be organizing and they're going to inspire organization. And I'm hopeful, but it's an open question. It's not going to be an overnight thing.
Roughly 5% of American gun owners belong to the National Rifle Association. People own guns for a wide variety of reasons, and I myself grew up in a household with many guns. My dad's a hunter and a gun collector, and it's an extremely common thing in this country. But I really do believe that this status quo can change and will change. I thought this even before the massacre in Florida and the emergence of these incredible young people who have galvanized the country to try to take courage and bind together and help pass meaningful firearms safety legislation. It's not going to happen with the current Congress. It's not going to happen with the current configuration of political power in Florida. But I do believe that it's possible that their failure to do anything in the aftermath of these horrible massacres will produce political change. And once that happens, then some meaningful changes are entirely possible.
Tom Diaz, author of Making a Killing, The Business of Guns in America. You also heard from Brian DeLay, Associate Professor of History at the University of California in Berkeley, Pamela Haag, author of The Gunning of America, and freelance journalist Josh Harkinson. The sound engineer is Judy Rapley. I'm Annabelle Quince, and this is Rear Vision on RN.
Well, there you go. Wasn't that a treat? Hey? An absolute little corker of a program to explain the history of the American firearms industry and culture. And as you can see, it's midnight. But I first heard that broadcast at midday on Saturday, and I've been waiting, midday Sunday it was. I've been waiting to be able to capture it, because the ABC Radio National suffers from funding cuts, and therefore if they broadcast something new and good once, they're going to broadcast it at least 3 or 4 times during the next 7 days. So, I think I'm going to go to bed now. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.